Darkness enveloped the small neighborhood as the policeman approached the home of a black family with hatred in his eyes. There was a crackling sound and bright flames began to consume their dwelling. Terrified screams echoed from within as he threatened to kill anyone who dared stand in his way. But what happened next shocked not only the family, but the entire neighborhood. What do you think happened? Write in the comments what your name is and where you are watching this video. From your opinion is very important to us. You help promote our channel and bring up important topics, and we appreciate every word you say. Your support helps us keep making these stories to expose hate and inspire change. You are part of our community, and together we can make the world a better place. Enjoy the show. In a dark corner of his office, surrounded by case files and an old computer, Saturday a cop named Dan. His gaze was cold, and there was a contemptuous grin on his lips. He hated the people he was called to protect, and especially those who didn't look like him. Black faces made him not only dislike them, but also rage. This feeling was not new. It had been ingrained in his mind since childhood, when he had heard his father tirelessly repeat racist jokes, eagerly sharing stereotypes with his sons, which they, in turn, absorbed like a sponge. Dan often daydreamed about how easy it would be to cleanse the streets of the undeserving. His perception of black people was skewed, as if they were all the same evil entity threatening his little world. He felt it was his responsibility to keep an eye on them, punish them for any slightest offense, and show them their place. In his eyes, they were just street proletarians, deserving neither respect nor understanding. Among his colleagues were others like him, police officers, who shared his views and biases. They laughed at jokes about problem neighborhoods and gloated when they saw someone whose skin was darker arrested. There was no room for humanity in their jokes, only hatred, which only grew stronger over time. Every time he wore the uniform, Dan felt omnipresent, as if he had the power to decide who was worthy of life and who was not. As darkness fell, his thoughts grew even darker. He dreamed of how he could impose order by force, and how he would deal with those who, in his opinion, broke the rules. This hatred burned him from the inside out, pushing him to take actions that had long been part of his plans. At times like this, he was ready to do anything to show who was in charge. With those thoughts in his head, he took to the streets where night duty awaited him. Hatred flared inside him as he waited for the right moment for his next operation. He knew today would be a special day, and his preconceptions would lead to what he had been waiting for so long. Nightfall enveloped the city, and the streets fell into an ominous silence. The soft glow of streetlights barely shone through the thick shroud of darkness, creating bizarre shadows on the pavement. Dan Saturday in his patrol car, his heart pounding with anticipation, his mind swirling with thoughts of the impending attack. His attention was drawn to the house of a black family at the end of the street. He knew it would be an excellent target. His hatred for them had been heated to the point of being overblown. This family had always seemed foreign to him, sullen and out of place in that area. Every evening as he drove by, he could feel the anger boiling up inside him, and it drove him to plan. What if I showed them who's boss? He pondered, hating their lives, their laughter, their habits. He was prepared to be violent, knowing that his actions would be considered proper in his warped perception of the world. A plan matured in his mind. Setting fire to the house was not just an act of violence. It would be a message to all others who dared to defy him. As the night deepened, fear became his ally. He knew the darkness would help hide his actions, and the fragile calm would give him the opportunity to strike at any moment. Dan had made his decision. He wasn't going to delay. He had all the courage he needed to carry out what he had planned. The pain he felt inside only fueled his resolve. He chose a moment when the family was home, full of life and hope. A light bulb burned inside, illuminating the cozy corner where they gathered together, unsuspecting of the impending threat. At that moment, Dan's hatred reached its peak. He got out of the car, pulling himself together and finally deciding that tonight it would be their trial. With a heart full of rage, he headed toward the house, his footsteps sounding in the silence like a harbinger of something terrible. He had a canister of gasoline in his hands, a simple tool to carry out his dark plans. As he approached the door, his heart was pounding with adrenaline and his mouth was dry with excitement. He realized that this decision would change everything. But in that moment, he felt no fear, just hatred. Cautiously, he approached the window and peered inside. The happy faces, the laughter of the children, the comfort, it was everything he despised. And in that moment, surrounded by darkness, Dan decided it was time for revenge. He spilled gasoline around the house, his hands shaking with excitement, and the thought flashed through his mind that the fear he was sowing would be his only reward. With one last look at the life he was about to destroy, Dan lit a match and threw it into the gasoline. The fire flared up greedily, filling the night with bright light and thick smoke. In that moment he felt power, feeling omnipotent in his hatred. The fear he felt himself had wrapped itself around him, and now he was the bearer of fear for others. Darkness enveloped the house, swallowing up its light and joy, and only one thing became clear. This night will forever be remembered as the night when hatred won out, and the world became a little more cruel. The fire, like a living entity, instantly consumed the wood, trying to free itself from the shackles created by matter itself. As soon as the match touched the gasoline, a bright flame erupted, and it became an invincible enemy to that which he hated so much. It was not just a flame, it was the embodiment of his hatred, of his inner demons that had burst forth in that ominous moment. The sound of the crackling fire reminded him of the screams he was ready to hear. He inhaled the warm air, soaked with bitterness and smoke, imagining how quickly the family would realize their world was crumbling. The flames grew, and with them his desire for revenge flared. As each ton of fire emphasized his sense of superiority, he realized that now he was becoming not just a policeman, but the controller of fate, deciding who had the right to live and who didn't. The light from the fire illuminated his face, which was frowning in contempt and gloating. He stood with his back against the cold wall and watched as the flames danced, consuming everything in their path. He could hear the fire engulfing the wooden beams, cracking and crunching as if the house itself was mourning its own fate. Soon his eyes glazed over with anticipation as the family ran out of the house in panic, screaming and looking for rescue. He imagined their faces contorted with horror as they saw their lives, their home, everything they had built go up in flames. "I am your judge," he whispered to himself as if it were an incantation. With each crack and flash, he felt more and more powerful. This wasn't just revenge. This was his understanding of justice. He wanted everyone to see how satisfying it was to watch them suffer. He dreamed of them desperately trying to save their possessions, of parents rushing from one window to another, looking for a way out, and children clutching their hands full of tears, not realizing what was happening. The laughter he had heard the previous evenings as he passed their house suddenly frowsy in his memory, like an ominous symphony filled with judgment. He remembered how they had played and enjoyed themselves together. It was a life he could not bear. They had no right to this happiness. They weren't supposed to live here, in his neighborhood, under his gaze. As the fire engulfed the roof, he felt his own adrenaline rise. He closed his eyes, letting thoughts of hate take over him. It was bliss, a feeling of power beyond compare. And as the flames greedily consumed everything, he realized that he had become the embodiment of what he despised most: fear, hatred, and cruelty. At that moment, he did not notice the streets filling with smoke and screams, the neighbors running out of their homes to see the horror unfolding before their eyes. He felt out of reach, like the devil himself, enjoying the destruction he had created. But as he stood there, immersed in his dark euphoria, sirens began to blare somewhere in the distance. Confusion was suddenly reflected on his face as he realized that his hatred might be coming to an end. But did it matter? The fire continued to burn, turning lives to ash. And he, the policeman, remained adamant in his madness, like an indomitable guardian of racism who still felt his power. The family sat around the table, chatting peacefully after a long day's work. The children's laughter filled the house with warmth and joy, creating an atmosphere of comfort and security. But at one moment, their happiness was shattered. A sharp crackle came from the window, and the smell of smoke began to penetrate their dwelling, burning their nostrils. The mother, Lena, was the first to notice how the shadows of the flames began to dance on the walls. "What is it?" she exclaimed in panic, rising from her seat. Her heart was pounding with anxiety, and her thoughts were racing rapidly from one possibility to another. A fire in their house! It seemed impossible, but the reality was terrifying. She rushed to the window and saw the flames engulfing their roofs like ravenous monsters. Panic gripped the family as they realized that their home, their sanctuary, was under attack. "Children, let's go!" she screamed, rushing to them to pull them from behind the table. Her son's small hands clenched in fear and they rose quickly, their eyes full of incomprehension and terror. "Mom, what's going on?" the eldest asked, looking anxiously at the smoke that was slowly filling the room. turning the warm glow of the lamps into eerie shadows. Lena grabbed their hands and pulled them toward the exit, her mind, as if in slow motion, not having time to process the entire disaster that was unfolding around them. "Hush, don't be afraid, we'll get out," she tried to reassure, but her own voice trembled with fear. She felt her heart clench with pain and despair, and she couldn't let herself get discouraged. For a moment she thought it was just a bad dream, but the fire left her in no doubt. A policeman stood outside, watching the scene like a play, while the family, trying to survive, ran out of the house. His black thoughts and prejudices could no longer control him, and with each of their screams his hatred only grew. "This is no place for you," he shouted to himself, savoring their terror. As they ran outside, Lena saw the neighbors start to run out of their houses, trying to figure out what was happening. The screams of her children and her own cries mingled with the crackling of the fire, creating an anxious chorus that filled the night. The faces of the neighbors were contorted with shock, and few of them were willing to come to the rescue. They all knew that blacks were treated with suspicion and fear in the neighborhood, and their hesitation only emphasized the deep prejudices present in the community. "Please, someone call the fire department," Lena shouted, casting a desperate glance at the crowd, who seemed frozen in horror, unable to believe what they were seeing. Their silence was unbearable, as if their own fears were overwhelming their desires to help. The youngest son, whom Lena was holding tightly by the arm, suddenly broke free and ran toward the flames. "Daddy," he shouted, but she managed to grab his shoulder and pull him sharply to her. "No, no, stay back. We have to get out of here." Her voice shook with fear and pain. As the flames devoured their home, burning away all the memories, love and hopes, Lena realized that everything she had built was in jeopardy. She could feel the hopelessness building. She hugged the children, their little hearts pounding in unison with hers, and in that moment, more than ever, she wanted to protect them from the evil of the world. And so, when the fire broke out and seemed to consume everything they loved, Lena felt she had to fight. Tears rolled down her cheeks, but she knew she could not give up. Together with the children, they rushed towards the neighboring house, where a flame of hope still burned. In a night filled with fear and suffering, they strove to survive in a world that showed its true evil nature. Lena's heart pounded in her chest as she and her children rushed to a neighboring house, where they could momentarily escape the relentless flames. But as soon as they reached a safe distance, hoarse shouts and taunts reached them. The policeman, who had remained on the scene, with his dark face illuminated by the fire, strode toward them with a confident, sullen gait, his eyes glowing with ruthless satisfaction. "Oh, family," he pronounced with a wry chuckle. "How does it feel to lose everything you have?" His voice sounded like a wicked melody penetrating his ears. Lena hugged the children and felt a chill creep up her spine. She realized that this man was not just a policeman, but the clear embodiment of hatred and bias. "I knew you didn't belong here," he continued, coming closer and closer, as if there was an ominous electricity emanating from his words. "You thought you could just occupy this neighborhood as if you were welcome here. No pity for the likes of you." Lena squeezed the children's hands, but they could no longer hold back their tears. She could feel the fear coursing through their hearts, and despair clutching her own. "Please go away. We haven't done anything to you," she screamed, though she knew inside that it wouldn't work. His eyes, full of hatred, only laughed at her plea. "How naive you are," he grinned contemptuously. "You will never realize that you are but a burden to this society. I'd gladly burn your house down again if it meant I'd be rid of you. No fire department can save you. All of you are just like your ancestors' beggars, immoral and unworthy." His words cut like sharp knives. Lena felt hatred creeping into her soul, but she knew this was not the time to show weakness. She leaned toward the children, and her heart clenched as she saw how afraid they were of this man. "Don't listen to him, kids. We'll make it," she whispered, trying to feel her voice with determination, even though her own legs were trembling with fear. But the policeman only grinned back at her words, as if he didn't believe any of her assertions. "Can you manage? You don't even have a roof over your heads," he continued, laughing, as if he found pleasure in their misery. "You should prepare for the worst. This is only the beginning. You think I won't find you? I'll always be around. And when you least expect it, I'll be back to remind you that you're out of place." The screams of panic in the air grew as neighbors, terrified and bewildered, began to distance themselves from this spectacle, not knowing how to intervene. They could hear the threats, but a terrible incomprehension slipped into their eyes. Lena realized that she could not count on their help when hatred once again raised its tentacles. "You'll always know who's in charge here, and if you decide to protest, or even just try to rebuild your life, you will know that I am capable of much. You have no defense, and your suffering is just entertainment for me." His words carried a fear she couldn't ignore. They emphasized helplessness when it seemed that nothing could save her family from this ruthless enemy. "Remember this," he uttered, pointing a finger in their direction, as if his every gesture was a weapon aimed at their future. There was not an ounce of regret in his eyes, only pleasure in their fear. With every word he said, Lena realized that the fight for their family's life was not over, but her inner fire was burning. She couldn't let this policeman win. Despite her fear, she knew she had to protect her children, even if she had to fight the worst thing she'd ever seen to do it. As they began to drift away, leaving them alone with their despair, Lena hugged her children tighter. They weren't just victims now. They were targets of a hatred that, though it lit up around them, couldn't completely consume their strength and hope for the future. When the policeman, satisfied that he had sown fear, stepped aside, Lena noticed how the neighbors began to come out of their houses, like puppets torn apart by strings. Their faces were contorted with shock, but Lena's eyes reflected something more, a hesitation caused by fear of the consequences. Among the crowd stood people she had known for years. They exchanged looks of uncertainty, but no one dared to approach. These were the same people she had once shared smiles and greetings with, but now there was an impenetrable wall of silence between them. What are they thinking? Lena tormented herself as the despair that encompassed her grew. The neighbor, Grace, tried to hide her anxiety behind a worried look. She knew Lena was a good mother, working at the local school, but she had preconceived stereotypes running through her head. She recalled conversations with other neighbors about how they shouldn't live in this neighborhood. Grace clenched her hands, her eyes flickering with the struggle of whether to help or stay away. What if I intervene and it gets worse? What if they attack me too? Her thoughts wandered through the maze of fear that still oppressed her. She understood that there was a certain order to her society, and to step outside of that order was to jeopardize her own safety. John, another neighbor, watched anxiously, his face expressing incomprehension. He had been raised in a culture where racism was the norm, but he had no malice in his heart. He had often heard his friends talk about refugees, and how, as he looked at Lenin's family, he couldn't shake the guilt. Why didn't I help? Why am I just standing here when they're in danger? His inner voice was tormenting him, but at the same time he was afraid to open his mouth. He felt that his life could change drastically if he took responsibility. This wasn't the first time things like this had happened in this neighborhood, and he knew that getting involved was a risk he wasn't willing to take. Here too, as in life, when it came to dealing with bias, those who experienced its effects were always at the forefront. Lena saw one of the neighbors she had once befriended start talking to another, using jokes about black people who cause trouble all the time. Those words reverberated in her soul like a knife penetrating her heart. I live here just like them. Lena's thoughts raged within her, but she knew she couldn't change other people's prejudices. She remembered how once, when they were going to a party, a neighbor had said disdainfully that people with skin like that shouldn't be allowed at the communal table. She tried to ignore those words, but they came back like a haunting echo. As the fire continued to consume their home, neighbors stood by like spectators on a theater stage. Some even took pictures on their cell phones, capturing this barbarism as entertainment. Their gazes sought confirmation and approval, but found none. Everyone watching knew that what was happening was wrong, but fear of the policeman and his sheer power suppressed any desire to intervene. Please help us, Lena screamed one last time, full of despair. Her words hung in the air like a pipe dream, but the neighbors only stared at the ground, and some turned away as if they answered her cry for help. They made excuses for their actions, reassuring themselves that perhaps it was just their problem. In that moment, Lena realized that they were not just spectators. They were participants in this sinister spectacle, living in a world where hatred and prejudice had power over life. She was alone, protecting her children from the relentless evil that Saturday inside this policeman and flowed into the hearts of those who were supposed to be her protectors. As the children's screams grew louder and the fire continued to rage, Lena decided she could wait no longer. She turned to her children and, full of determination, said, "We can't stay here. We have to find a safe place. Let's leave." It was the only solution that could save them. While the neighbors stood around, unsure of what to do, Lena knew that her courage must overcome her fear. Even if the world was against them, she would fight for her children until her last breath. With that thought, she pulled her children further away from the fire and hatred, leaving behind the terror and betrayal. Gathering her strength, Lena pulled the children toward the street, where the neighbors stood tightly together, full of fear and confusion. Their eyes were fixed on the blazing house, and each of them realized that something had to be done. Internal conflicts plagued them, and soon a few brave men dared to step forward. John was the first to step forward, deciding he could not stay away any longer. His voice shook, but he raised it, addressing the crowd. "We can't just stand here and do nothing. They need help." A fire of determination burned in his eyes that prompted others to start moving. "But what can we do? It's a policeman," exclaimed Grace, who was still hesitating. She felt her heart pounding, but her inner struggle continued to hold her back. "He's not just some man out there. He has power, and if we interface, it could end badly for us." "But what if it could end badly for them?" John objected, glancing at Lena and her children. "We can't just watch them get killed. They're our neighbors, our friends." Lena's screams, full of fear and despair, resounded in the air, filling it with emotional tension. Still holding the children's hands, she turned to John, full of hope. "Please help us. We can't handle this alone." At this point, Sarah, a neighbor who had been silent for a long time, came to the forefront. She was known for her active involvement in local affairs, but her inner fears and prejudices had kept her on the sidelines until now. "I know it's wrong, but I'm afraid that if we get involved, we might be accused of supporting crime." Her voice shook as she struggled to find the words. "But it's not a crime," John exclaimed, his voice rising higher and higher. "It's a crime to leave people to die because of the color of their skin. We have to show that it's unacceptable." He took a step forward, but Grace grabbed his arm. "What are you doing? This is crazy," she whispered, her eyes full of fear. "You don't know what he's capable of. But if we do nothing, we'll be no better than he is," John said angrily. His words made an impression on the others, and a change began to take place in the crowd. Some began to whisper about the need to help, while others still looked on in horror at the situation. "I can't stay here and just watch," Sarah said in desperation, her voice beginning to shake with emotion. "I'll go with you, John. If we're together, maybe it will protect us." As if on cue, the other neighbors began to raise their heads, contemplating their actions. They approached John and Sarah slowly, unsure but willing to support the decision to intervene. "We have to act fast," John exclaimed, realizing that time was running out. He headed toward Lena and her children. "Pull yourselves together. We're going to help you before it's too late." Lena looked at them hopefully, her heart filled with warmth at the realization that not all the neighbors were indifferent. She felt her courage begin to grow. Thank you all," she exhaled, and her voice filled with gratitude. But the policeman watching the scene only grinned as he saw people starting to unite. "What are you going to do? You can try, of course, but you still have no power to stop me," he shouted, his voice full of contempt. "We will not stand by and watch you threaten this family," John replied, his voice sounding firm despite the panic brewing around him. The neighbors began to group together, and soon a small front line formed in their ranks. "Are you out of your mind?" Grace intervened again, fear and indecision flashing in her eyes. "He's a policeman. He could arrest you or something, but they don't deserve this fate," John growled, turning toward her. "If we do nothing, we'll be as guilty as he is." Neighbors began discussing exactly how they could help. Some suggested calling local news stations to draw attention to the incident. Others brought up phones that could record the entire situation. "Now we have an opportunity to show that this is wrong," said one of them, holding up a cell phone. Gathering in a single impulse, they decided to come forward. As soon as they started moving towards Lena, a policeman started shouting frantically to stop them. "Do you all want trouble? Are you all going to become enemies of the law? I will destroy you." But his threats only strengthened the neighbors' resolve. They surrounded Lena and her children, and Lena felt hope ignite in her. This opportunity was their chance. They began to form a living chain around her, like a protective wall that could stop the hatred. "We're here to protect you," John shouted, his voice full of determination. "We're not going to let this man hurt you." Neighbors began to speak up, exchanging ideas and plans. "Let's call the local media and explain what's going on here. It will become public and he won't be able to escape the consequences," Sarah suggested, and many began nodding in agreement. At that moment, despite the flames burning behind them, Lena felt that her family was not alone. The sense of unity, however fragile, filled her soul with hope. She knew there would be many challenges ahead, but now that the neighbors had sprung into action, she had a new desire to fight for her children's safety. Lena soon realized that not only her life was in jeopardy, but the lives of the entire community. They had a chance to make a difference in this world of hatred and prejudice, and now she was ready to fight for her family and her community. Despite the brutality they faced, the screams of the neighbors and Lena's cries filled the air. But the policeman, seeing the situation spinning out of control, pulled out his phone and started dialing. Evil sparks flashed in his eyes, and his voice became hoarse with rage. "I need backup," he uttered, taking cover behind the protective armor of his position. "It's urgent. We've got a riot involving blacks and whites. I can't handle this alone." The policeman's words sounded like a verdict, and his fears were translated into threats. He was determined to quell the rebellion, and his phone call was just the beginning. "What the hell are you all doing? These people have no right to help. Get them out of here or I'll use force," he growled into the receiver, his voice sounding menacing and angry. Lena noticed how her neighbors began to pale with horror. They did not know how they would proceed. Each of them realized that police intervention could have serious consequences. "We need to get out of here," Grace whispered, her voice full of fear. "He'll call his friends, and then things will end badly for us." "No," Sarah replied sharply, her face burning with determination. "We can't just run away when they're in danger. We have to be here to protect them. If we retreat, it will only add to their suffering." John nodded, sharing her feelings. "We can't let this policeman suppress our community. We have to be strong." He looked at Lena, her eyes full of fear and hope. "We'll be with you. We won't leave you alone." Meanwhile, the policeman finished talking and looked at his neighbors with a contemptuous smirk. "My colleagues are approaching. You all want trouble. I can provide you with them." His voice sounded like a curse, and he took a step forward, as if intending to get between the neighbors and Lena and the children. The neighbors glanced around, their indecision becoming apparent. "What should we do? How should we act?" whispered one woman, her voice trembling with fear. "We must stand together, shoulder to shoulder," John pronounced, setting an example of confidence. "If we are disunited, he can intimidate us individually. We must unite." But just as they began to gather, a blue light ran down the street. The flashing lights of police cars filled the space, and the sound of sirens cut through the silence, like the harbinger of an impending storm. The screams and cries of children all around echoed off the walls, creating an atmosphere of even greater terror. When the reinforcements arrived, several policemen got out of their cars, all in uniform, guns at the ready. They seemed to feel on top of the world, as if they were not only representatives of the law, but the embodiment of it. "What's going on here?" one of them asked, casting a contemptuous glance at Lena and her family. "Nothing you should be worried about," replied the policeman who started the whole thing, showing his authority. "It's just black people making trouble. I'll punish them if they don't calm down." In parallel with their appearance, the neighbors were becoming more and more uncomfortable. "Maybe we better leave after all," Grace whispered, still distraught. "They might want to arrest us." "No, Grace, stay here," Sarah said with determination. "If we leave, we'll betray them. We need to protect them, even if it's risky." A huge police car slowed down, and two policemen who looked like steel colossi got out. One of them, large and menacing, reached for Lena, pointing at her children. "Hey you, get them off the street or we'll intervene," he thundered, his voice sounding like thunder. Lena, shocked, stood hugging her children, not knowing what to say. She felt her heart beating in unison with every thread that came out of the police officers' mouths. "We didn't do anything wrong," she shouted, her voice trembling with fear. "We just want to be safe." "Safety? Is it you who think you can feel safe when your kind break the law? You think you can count on protection from us?" The policeman replied, his eyes glittering with hatred. "You are all criminals, and we will deal with you as you should be dealt with." The neighbors stood there, full of indecision, realizing that all their courage could disappear in an instant. One of the policemen grabbed his baton and took a step in their direction, waiting for one of them to leave the line. "Get your hands off her," John shouted, his voice sounding full of bravery. "You have no right to threaten her." Like magnets, everyone's eyes turned to him. He realized that all eyes were fixed on him, and his words could have repercussions. "We're all here to protect each other. We won't let you tear our family apart." But instead of responding to his boldness, the policemen only grinned, confident in their power, And what are you going to do about it? You're all just a disgrace to this neighborhood. The neighbors stood there, torturing themselves with questions about what to do. Every breath they took was filled with fear and despair. The sense of danger was so real that some of them felt their knees trembling. At this point, John, gathering his strength, stepped forward. If you want to arrest us, you'll have to arrest us all. We're not afraid of you. His voice sounded like a challenge. Lena looked at him, her heart overflowing with gratitude. She realized that this was a moment when everything could change. In this world of hatred and prejudice, the only thing that could stop the madness was unity and courage. The policeman, hearing his words, frowned. Don't expect any help. You'll all just drown yourselves in this hatred. But in the face of the threat, the neighbors, all together, began to unite, realizing that now that they had moved beyond their fear, they were not only witnesses but participants. Hatred could have torn them apart, but they were willing to fight, protecting each other in this conflict that could be their last battle. The crowd of neighbors stood united despite their fear, but the police officers who surrounded Lena's family began to show overt acts of aggression and racism. It was as if each policeman who stepped out of his car felt superior to everyone else, as if their humiliation and aggression were part of a game they intended to win. They demonstrated their power with ecstasy, as if it was not just an act, but a true pleasure. Look at them, one of the policemen said gruffly, pointing at Lena and her children, who were hiding behind John and Sarah. His mocking tone caused waves of humiliation. Look at the way they look, trying to evoke pity, but really they're just criminals. As if hearing the signal, other police officers began to pick up on his words, fueling the hatred in the air. Why are they even here? It's not like they're supposed to be in this neighborhood. They don't belong here, shouted another policeman, waving his baton as if it was his only argument. Lena, feeling the world around her begin to disintegrate, held the children tighter, pulling them close to her. She could feel the fear overwhelming her, but instead of giving up, she decided she had to be strong. We're not criminals. We just want to live in peace, she shouted, her voice trembling but with determination in it. To this the policeman only laughed. Peace? You want peace? What kind of peace is peace if your parents are still involved in crime? We are here to maintain order, not to tolerate people like you, replied one of them contemptuously. Look at them trying to act like they have a right to be here, another policeman pronounced as he approached John. You black people always thought you could do whatever you wanted, but you don't. We're here to show you who's in charge. He shoved John sharply in the chest, forcing him to back away. Watch out for him, John shouted, refusing to let the policeman break himself. You have no right to treat us like this. His words filled the air with bravery, but also with frantic tension. The policeman only smiled in response, pleased with their advantage. What are you going to do about it, hero? We're bullying you and you don't like it? Did you really think you could just take the law in your stride like that? Growled one of them, as if that was something to be praised. The neighbors, watching the whole scene, felt the tension rising, their hatred for the policemen growing. As if pushed by some invisible impulse, they began to protest against the humiliation. This is wrong. You can't treat them like this, Sarah shouted, her voice sounding like a mantra, reflecting the anger they all felt. You have no right to demean people for their skin color, John continued, standing up in Lena's defense. He understood that their fight was not just for their neighbors, but for their own lives. We're all human beings, and we deserve respect. The policeman, hearing this, started laughing again, but there was a glimmer of displeasure in their eyes. And you think your words mean anything? These people are just parasites, and they get what they deserve, one of them said with such fury that his colleagues agreed with him with nods. At that moment, Lena felt a new flame ignite within her. We will not be silent when you say such things, she shouted, full of determination. Her voice broke through the fear like a sword piercing the darkness. You cannot take away our humanity. But the policeman only scoffed at her, as if it were an amusing joke. Look, she's talking about humanity when her ancestors were slaves. You all think you can just stand up against the law like that? That's unacceptable, one of them continued, filling every word with hatred. The neighbors, standing at Lena's side, began to feel the growing strength of unity. We will not allow you to humiliate our family, Grace shouted, her voice full of anger. It's not just their fight, it's our fight. Like a spark, Grace's words inspired the others. Neighbors began to rise and shout words of support, encouraging each other. creating a circle of unity around Lena and her children. Even though they were outnumbered, their determination continued to grow. The policemen, realizing that their intimidation was not working, began to act more aggressively. One of them stepped closer, glaring fiercely at John. "If you don't disperse, I'll have you all arrested. There is no place in this neighborhood for the likes of you." His threat resembled an angry whisper, and it was a clear warning. "That won't stop us," shouted John, not backing down. He realized that in this conflict, they had to fight not only for themselves, but for the future of everyone involved. They had to show that hatred could not win, that they would stand together despite all the threats and humiliation. Meanwhile, the police officers, seeing their authority beginning to crumble, once again rushed to Lena and her children. "You have nowhere to go, and this time you get what you deserve," shouted one of them, and they all began to move forward like swords ready to strike. But at that moment, when the situation seemed hopeless, the neighbors, uniting, shouted in unison, "We stand together. We will not be silent." This choral voice, like a puff of wind, made the policemen stop for a moment, and in that silence Lena realized that their hatred could not break their spirit. Gathering her strength, Lena lifted her head, her eyes shining with determination. She knew that the hatred they faced was only a temporary shadow, but the unity they had created was a real strength, and with that strength, they were ready to fight to the end. The moment the tension reached its limit, the atmosphere around Lena's family and neighbors became even more ominous. The police officers, clustered together, began to exchange glances full of arrogance and contempt. Their gloating smiles reflected the certainty that they were on the side of force rather than justice. "Look at them like a bunch of mice trying to get to their feet. Their place is under our boot," said one of the policemen, large and pumped up, with a long mustache. His laughter sounded like a loud bang, echoing in the silence that enveloped the scene. "Yeah, that's right. They all think they can just come here and take what they want. We have to show them who's boss," the other replied, his voice full of sarcasm. He shook his head as if disregarding everything in front of him. "If I were in their shoes, I'd just shut up and not get in trouble." "I agree. These blacks don't realize at all that the laws are not written for them. What's the point of talking to them? They only create chaos." The third one put in, his words full of contempt. They began to laugh at their own jokes, and it was not just laughter, but mockery of those they considered unworthy. Meanwhile, Lena, standing with the children, felt the waves of hatred crashing against the walls of their little world. Every laugh from the policeman was like a punch in the face. "Why do they say that?" she whispered to the children, trying to cover their ears. "Why do they hate us?" John, still standing in the foreground, could not remain indifferent to this humiliation. "You have no right to talk like that," he shouted, addressing the police officers. "You're supposed to protect us, not threaten us." The policeman, hearing his words, turned to him again with disdain. "Protect? We're here to restore order, and you underlings are only getting in our way," said one of them, pointing at John as if he were a target for his anger. "You all created your own fate, and now you're paying for your mistakes," he continued, building up the pressure as if about to explode with anger. "You think we should feel sorry for you? Please don't make me laugh." The neighbors stood bewildered, their indecision beginning to recede, but the police officers' hatred only grew. They took steps forward like predators ready to strike. "If you don't calm down, you'll all get your rations," another policeman said hatefully, looking around the group as if assessing which of them could be punished first. The cries of Lena and her children were stifled by their threats. "It's not our fault that you hate us. We just want to live," she screamed, her voice sounding full of despair. The policemen began to whisper amongst themselves, their conversations full of hatred and contempt. "Maybe it's time to show them what real police means. It's time to teach these guys a lesson," one of them said, clutching a baton in his hands. "I agree. It's time to put an end to this morass. They don't realize that in our world, we're the ones keeping them afloat. Without us, they wouldn't exist," the other added, his voice sounding like a sentence. None of the neighbors dared to raise their voices, knowing that their resistance could lead to more suffering. But despite their fear, a spark of hatred for hatred ignited in their hearts. As if sensing this, the police officers began to actively move towards them, their confidence becoming apparent. "You may think you can stop us, but you can't. We're here to restore order, and if you don't like it, that's your problem," shouted one of the policemen, looming over John. At that moment, John felt his heart beating faster. He knew that if he didn't step forward, he would become part of this hateful system. We're not going to be silent. It's not just your words, it's our lives, he shouted, turning to his neighbors. Lena, seeing his courage, decided to support him. If we stay silent, they will break us. We must unite. Her voice was full of determination, and she hugged her children. Her gaze was full of hope, and it inspired the neighbors. Gathering their strength, they began to move forward as one, their courage shining through their fear. The hatred that the police were spewing could not stop their quest for freedom and justice. The cops, seeing that their intimidation wasn't working, began to lose patience. You're all just a bunch of losers. If you want to fight, we'll show you what real strength means, growled one of them. And at the moment, everyone realized that the threat coming from them were not just words. But even under the pressure of hatred and aggression, the neighbors knew that in unity is their strength. And in this moment, when hatred reached its peak, they were one step closer to putting an end to this mad game. Together they stood ready to face all the difficulties that lay ahead, and their unity became their weapon in this struggle. As the tension grew, the atmosphere around Lena's family and the police officers became more and more critical. As they watched, the locals stood frozen in horror, tormented by internal contradictions. Some of them, who had once considered themselves friends of the family, now wondered which side they should be on, whose truth would be more convincing. Among the crowd was Mark, who had lived next door to Lena for many years. He knew their family, saw how they struggled to survive, how they raised their children in a world full of prejudice, but now he could feel his heart being torn apart as the hatred of the cops seeped into his soul. If I stand up for them, I risk losing everything, but if I stand aside, how will I be able to look my children in the eye? He thought, struggling with himself. Why aren't you acting? Why are you just standing here and letting this happen? Shouted John, addressing the neighbors. His words filled the space with anger and frustration, but deep down each of them knew that something had to be done about this hatred. John's gaze was determined, but around him stood people gripped by fear. Some of the neighbors, not daring to look into the eyes of others, whispered, "It's the police. They're always right, aren't they? If we side with these people, we'll be in trouble." The others agreed with him, as if the stigma of betrayal was reflected on their faces. "You don't have to believe in us, but you have to see what's going on. We're just people who want to live," shouted John, feeling his voice begin to give way under the pressure of despair. At this time, the police officers, sensing that the atmosphere was beginning to heat up, used their intimidation tactics. One of them, jostling with those around him, growled, "If you don't keep quiet, I will arrest you all. We are here to restore order, not to listen to your nonsense." Hearing this, Mark felt his inner conflict reaching its peak. He looked at Lena and her children, who stood in awe, clenched in each other's arms. "I can't stay silent any longer," he whispered, filling his words with determination. "This hatred is not mine. We must not let them do this." Despite his inner doubts, he stepped forward. "I'll side with the family. I can't watch you humiliate them," he uttered, his voice shaky but carrying a strength it didn't know he had. But the other neighbors began to back away. "Are you out of your mind? If you support them, you'll lose everything," one of them shouted back. The hatred of the policemen was mixed with panic among the locals. Each of them could feel the fear growing inside them for their own safety and that of their families. "How can you stand by when such evil is happening? We're all human beings and we have to protect each other," John shouted, turning to Mark. "Our strength is in unity," but contradictions continued to oppress the crowd. Some neighbors began to huddle together, taking refuge behind others. "I don't know who to believe. These police officers are the law, and they're just regular people," one woman said, her voice full of fear. "The law is made for protection, not oppression," another neighbor intervened, his face reflecting anger. "They're inciting hatred, and that's wrong." Meanwhile, the police officers, realizing that their threat was not working as they expected, decided to resort to manipulation tactics. One of them stepped forward and addressed the crowd. "You know, they're not just ordinary people. They are a threat to our society. They are just waiting for the moment to do us harm." The crowd began to whisper, their eyes darting between the policemen and Lena's family. The injustice they spoke of was recreating the image of the enemy in their minds. "Maybe he's right. Maybe we don't know the whole truth," tormented themselves with the thoughts of the locals. "You're your own enemies if you keep believing this nonsense. You just want to scare us," John shouted, but his words echoed in the cold silence. Mark, standing at the edge of the crowd, felt his heart wavering between fear and hope. He knew he had to act. Determination stirred within him, and raising his voice, he said, "If we don't support each other, we will lose everything. We can't let this happen." But his words were met only with silence. Each of them stood in their own dark abyss, not knowing what to do next. They felt that their lives and future generations depended on what they did now. Hope and fear intertwined, creating a dark canvas on which to paint their choices. Each of them knew that in the end, they would have to make a choice, leave their doubts behind and stand up for what was right, or give in to fear and become part of the system that oppressed their neighbors. Their inner torment grew, as did the darkness surrounding them. As light and shadow struggled for power in their hearts, it became increasingly clear that justice does not always mean right, and each of them was at a crossroads on which their fate depended. The crowd continued to waver between fear and determination as the policeman, baton in hand, took a step toward Lena's family. His face was contorted with hatred, and the same darkness that made people tremble shone in his eyes. He was ready to humiliate and break, stoking the flames of hatred. "Look at them," he pronounced, casting a contemptuous glance at the family. "What are these bastards? What do you want with this country? You'll never be able to feed into our society. You're just parasites, living off the labor of others." His voice sounded loud and cruel, like an order. The crowd frowned in anticipation. Some of the locals were uncomfortable with his words, but fear suppressed their desire to intervene. Lena, standing with the children, felt her heart clenched with bitterness and humiliation. She knew that this attack was more than just a verbal assault. It was an attack on everything she and her family represented. "You have no right to this house. You have no rights at all. It's not your place, and it never will be," the policeman continued, his words sounding like poison arrows piercing the atmosphere of hatred. He relished the way his every rebuke made Lena and her children feel even more vulnerable. "Look at those darkies." He glanced at John, whom he considered the head of the family. "You think you can call the shots? What have you even done to earn that right? You should just shut up and let us do what we have to do. You don't know how a normal society functions." His words sounded like a curse, his voice full of contempt and arrogance. John, hearing his family humiliated, felt anger building in his chest. "We are human beings. We are entitled to dignity and respect," he shouted, his voice not sounding as strong as he wanted it to. "No one can take away our rights just because of the color of our skin." But the policeman only grinned back. "Rights? What rights? Your life here is just a whim. You are nothing, and that will never change." His smile was cold and his expression was unyielding. He took a step closer, as if wanting to scare them even more. The crowd, still standing still, frowned with horror. Watching this scene, the locals realized that a chasm of hatred had opened up in front of them, into which they could fall if they did not take action. Deep inside them, questions arose. Why are we silent? Why can't we protect them? Lena, feeling more vulnerable than ever, decided not to give up. "We have a right to this land. We are a family, and we will not be silent," she uttered, her voice beginning to fill with power, but the policeman only brushed off her words. "Family? You call that family? You only dishonor that word. You stinking lowlifes. You should be thankful we even let you breathe in this city." His hatred poured out, as if he was savoring every second of this power he felt. The neighbors finally began to realize that this hatred could be directed against them as well. "This is evil," someone in the crowd whispered, beginning to realize the reality of what was happening. They felt the need to act, but the fear remained to grow. "You have no right to say that," John shouted again, clenching his fists in anger. "Your hatred only makes you look worse than we are." But his words seemed only to increase the policeman's excitement. "Tell me, how do you plan to handle this? What do you even dream of, about being just like us? This is ridiculous," said the policeman with a sneer, ready to use their fear to finally break their spirit. The silence in the air was becoming unbearable. Lena clutched the children closer to her, despair overwhelming her. She knew that if they did not stand together, this evil could destroy them. She raised her head and said, "We will not let you humiliate us. We must stand together in spite of fear." But no matter how hard she tried, she felt the cops' hatred fill the space around them like an ominous shadow. Terror and fear had become their enemies. They all stood on the edge of the abyss, fighting the unyielding darkness, ready to fight for their dignity. but no one knew how long they could withstand the onslaught. The policeman, seeing that the situation was escalating, began to threaten even more, his hatred only increasing. "I will find you wherever you are. No one will be able to protect you when we decide to destroy you," he shouted, his voice echoing throughout the neighborhood like an echo of unrelenting hatred. Lena and John felt their strength leaving them, but deep down they knew that despite the fear and humiliation, they had to keep fighting. No words could erase their dignity, and it was this knowledge that gave them the strength to face all the challenges that lay ahead. Like an invisible virus, hatred began to eat away at the local community, dividing it into camps. Some neighbors began to openly support the policeman, sincerely believing that he was right and that he was only doing his duty. Others, gripped by fear and guilt, could not decide which side to take, but inside them, a desire for justice was brewing. Lena's family was at the center of this conflict, like a knife edge that not only wounds its target but also strikes others. Tensions began to affect every family in the neighborhood. Doors swung open, neighbors looked outside, whispered to each other, creating a chain of rumors and speculation that only fueled hatred and fear. "I never thought it would come to this, but can you just let it go that easily?" Mark pronounced, standing on the doorstep of his house. Turning to John, their gazes met in a tense pause as Mark looked to his friend for support one last time. "I don't know how to help. If I take your side, I could lose everything," he added, his voice shaking with stress. "So that's your moral position? You would leave us to our fate just because you are afraid? We are your neighbors, your community. How can you do this?" John clenched his fists, feeling rage overwhelm him. He longed for support, but instead he saw people begin to drift away, as if the threat of the policeman was breaking the bond that united them all. Mark sighed, realizing he was at a crossroads himself. "It's all so complicated, John. They're stronger than us. They have the power. But what about us? What can we do?" he said bitterly, though he could feel his soul tearing apart with the desire to do the right thing. Meanwhile, open conversations began among neighbors who supported the police officers. One evening, gathered in the backyard, a group of several families exchanged views on what was happening. "Why should we protect these people? All they do is embarrass our neighborhood," said one of them, his voice filled with a confidence that bordered on aggression. "Did you hear what happened to them? It was their own fault. If they hadn't provoked them, none of this would have happened." The other one chimed in, his words only fueling the hatred in the eyes of his interlocutors. Hate began to sprout like weeds in a flower garden, overshadowing all other feelings. In the midst of this chaos, the conflict was escalating. A neighbor who had been a former good friend of Lena's family was now openly condemning them. "I just can't believe they live among us. Do you see what they do? It's just unbearable," he shouted, not noticing how his words echoed in the hearts of others with hatred and betrayal. Watching this, the other neighbors began to be perplexed. Is this really normal? Are we really going to support such ideas? This is just awful, someone in the crowd muttered, feeling the desire to speak out against hate growing in him. But the voice of reason was drowned out by cries of anger. "You just don't understand what it means to be a true citizen. They are not part of our society, and that's not up for discussion," the police supporters kept repeating, creating an atmosphere of disunity that enveloped the streets like the darkness before a storm. Conflict in the community quickly escalated into open clashes. Different groups began to organize meetings to discuss how to deal with the situation. Soon the locals split into two camps. Some supported Lena's family, while others sided with the police officers. Every meeting ended with shouts and threats. "We have to stop them. They shouldn't be here," shouted one of the policeman's defenders, his words eliciting approving nods among the like-minded. A neighbor named Tom, who had been silent for a long time, now snapped out of his musings. "Why do we keep getting into this? We're supposed to be together. Isn't that the main thing?" he shouted, addressing everyone. His words, though sincere, only caused bewilderment. Fear and hatred had already filled the hearts of his neighbors, and it became difficult for them to see what united them in the first place. "How can you talk about unity when it is your community that supports violence and hatred?" one of the women asked, her voice shaking with anger. "You are betraying us by allowing this to continue." Meanwhile, the policeman, feeling his power growing stronger, did not miss the opportunity to further inflame the conflict. "Look how these people fight among themselves. They are destroying themselves. We're just doing our jobs. But you're just pathetic lowlifes. he uttered, enjoying the way his words poured into people's hearts, turning them into instruments of hatred. The locals stood on the edge of a precipice, fighting not only each other but also their own fears and prejudices. Each of them felt hatred creeping into their homes, affecting even those who had not been involved in conflicts before. So the divisions only deepened, and the streets of their small town became an arena for hatred and fear. The cohesion that had once been the foundation of their community was slowly eroding, and the only thing left was to survive in a world where hatred had become the only truth. The state of fear that enveloped Lena's family became unbearable. Every rustle outside the window, every touch of wind seemed to them a harbinger of trouble. John, realizing the gravity of the situation, understood that now they had to act if they wanted to protect themselves and their children. But how can they fight the system when everyone is against them? We can't just sit around and wait for them to come for us, he said, trying to hide the trepidation in his voice. Lena, holding the children by the shoulders, nodded, feeling her heart pounding with fear. Every day, every hour, they lived under threat, and that feeling robbed them of peace. We need to find a way to report what's going on, to tell someone who can help, she added, clenching her fists to hide a shiver. But deep down, she knew their options were limited. Every time they tried to go outside, the threat of the policeman became more and more apparent. We could try contacting an organization that fights racism and police violence, John suggested, but once they find out what we're doing, it might draw their attention to us. We need to proceed with caution. At the same time, there was shouting and noise in the street. Lena and the children pressed themselves against the window, watching the police patrols drive by like predators looking for their prey. They didn't just drive by, they caused fear. Every time they appeared was like a stab in the heart, awakening all the worst memories of what had happened to them. Why do we have to be victims? Why do we have to be silent? John shouted, taking his eyes off the window. We can't let them break us. His words were filled with determination, but Lena felt fear clutching her throat. What if they decide to come after us? We won't be able to protect the children if they come, she said, her voice shaking with emotion. She tried to be strong, but in that moment, all her resolve crumbled under the pressure of fear. John stepped closer, hugging Lena and the children. We have to leave our home. It's the only way to escape their hatred, he said, feeling determination fighting his own fear. He knew that leaving home was a risk, but staying within four walls, waiting for imminent disaster, seemed even more dangerous. Where are we going to go? We have no money, no place to go, Lena pronounced, her heart heavy with despair. But John didn't give up. Maybe we can find shelter with an old friend. I know she'd be willing to help if she knew what was going on. He squeezed out, his thoughts whirling for a solution. Nevertheless, every second spent in the house became more and more unbearable. Night shrouded the city again, and with it came fear, like a dark silhouette that would not leave them. The children hid under their blankets, knowing that something terrible was happening outside. Lena could hear their whispers, their frightened looks. She tried to calm them, but she could feel herself shaking with fear. It's going to be okay, little ones. We'll make it through, she whispered, trying to convince herself of that. A storm was raging inside her, and every minute felt like an eternity. We can grab some stuff and leave before it's too late, John suggested again, starting to pack the necessary items into his backpack. He tried to speak calmly, but his hands were shaking with excitement. He realized that every minute was important. Lena remembered with horror how the policeman had threatened them. Every word he said sounded like a sentence in her head. We have to be careful, she pronounced. If they see us, they won't stop. As they were gathering, rumbling sounds outside the window made them freeze. It's them. They're coming, Lena whispered, her voice soaked with terror. At that moment, fear filled the space, and they both knew if they didn't act now, their chances of escape would tend toward zero. John slid the door open and, holding it ajar, looked out into the street. A police car pulled up in front of their house, and two officers got out, laughter and wicked jokes echoing in the air. Where are you going? Blacks, we want your heads, and we've come for you, heard one of them say. At that moment they realized that time was up. With their hearts pounding in unison with their fear, John and Lena squeezed each other and decided that, despite the terror, they must try to escape. We're leaving now, John said quietly, and grabbing the children, they headed for the exit, sharpening their resolve to escape the darkness that was coming. They didn't know what was waiting for them behind the door, But they knew one thing: they had to be brave to survive. Every step, every breath reminded them that they were fighting not only for their lives, but also for the future they hoped to build. Even as everything around them crumbled, the events that unfolded that dark evening quickly spread around the neighborhood. News of the attack on Lena's family soon filled local newspapers and social media. The public reaction varied, but it clearly showed deep racial prejudice that had been building up for years. People began to divide into the camps, each with their own arguments and their own truth. Some neighbors supporting the police officers soon organized a meeting at a local club. This family should know their place, they provoke and then complain about the consequences, or shouted from the back rows. There was a sense of unity in the air, based on shared hatred and prejudice. Are we supposed to just watch this? They're breaking the law, and it's wrong. One of the participants spoke, his voice full of confidence and hatred. He gestured to documents proving that Lena and her family had been in trouble with the law in the past. For him, this became an excuse for the brutality with which the police officers had acted. The people who were previously considered good neighbors were now standing in a row, showing their true colors. These people shouldn't be here. They are just a disgrace to our neighborhood and a threat to our children, one woman said, her words eliciting cheers from the policemen's supporters. They nodded in approval, as if finding support in their own madness. But not everyone shared their opinion. On the other side of town, a group of activists gathered for a peaceful rally to support Lena's family. "We are here to say, hate has no place in our community," shouted one of the organizers, his voice booming loudly among the many people. They held signs that read "No to Racism" and "Justice for All." Nevertheless, even among those who condemned the policeman's actions, shadows of doubt were often voiced. Maybe they really did something to provoke him, some whispered, feeling internally conflicted. This uncertainty only emphasized existing racial prejudices, creating a shaky ground for hatred and mistrust. Tom, a local resident who has always tried to mediate, sensed public opinion becoming increasingly divided. "We have to remember that we're all human beings," he tried to say at a meeting of supporters of the police officers. "We can't just generalize. That's not what we want." But his voice was barely audible amidst the shouting and hatred coming from all sides. "What do you know about what they're going through? You've never faced a real threat," someone in the crowd shrieked, and his words were met with cheers of approval. "We're supposed to protect our neighborhood, not those who shouldn't be here," added another. The neighborhood was turning into a battlefield, and every breath was filled with tension. The debate became increasingly heated, and the hatred grew like an indomitable fire. "These people just don't want to admit that they're not like us," one of the participants uttered, his voice full of contempt. "They should just be kicked out the door." Meanwhile, a storm broke out on social media. People started sharing their opinions, and each post became another drop in the ocean of hatred. The posts about Lena's family were filled with insults and threats. "It's their own fault. If they weren't like this, nothing would have happened," shouted the commenters, not realizing that their words only reinforced the existing problems. But there were also those who tried to raise their voices for justice. "This family does not deserve what happened to them," activists wrote, but their messages were drowned in a flood of hate and prejudice. There was a growing sense in the community that racism had become the norm. When the local media began to cover the events, they tended to resort to templates that confirmed biases. Headlines describing Lena's family sounded like offender family victimized by their own actions, and this only added fuel to the fire. Public opinion reinforced racial stereotypes, inciting hatred and making people think that they not only had the right to judge, but even the obligation to do so. Lena, unaware of what was happening outside her home, could only feel society turning its back on her. She could feel the hatred creeping into their lives, condemning them to go-do humanity. The children, trying to cope with the stress, asked questions about what was going on, but she couldn't answer. Each question only emphasized how dangerous their situation was, and how hate was building up around them. Public opinion became an instrument of division and hatred, as a tool to hurt and humiliate. Lena's family found themselves in the center of a storm, where everyone was waiting for just the right moment to attack, to accuse, to condemn. At that moment, they realized that the real struggle was just beginning, and each step would be even harder than the last. The situation in the district was heating up. Society was split into two camps, and hatred began to turn violent. In the midst of this chaos, However, sparks of hope began to emerge. A group of local residents, shocked by the police brutality and the reaction to it, decided to unite and speak out against violence and racism. It wasn't easy, but their goal was clear: to protect Lena's family and show that hate had no place in their community. The activists' meeting was held in a small local center. When they entered the hall, the atmosphere was tense. Everyone present felt that at stake was not only the fate of Lena and her family, but also the moral fate of the entire town. We can't stay silent any longer. We must show that racism and violence should not determine our common destiny, said Michael, one of the organizers, his voice full of determination. Those gathered began to share their stories. Each word sounded like a challenge. My brother was arrested for no reason, said a young woman, her voice shaking with emotion. I'm tired of this madness. We must unite and act. They were joined by Tom, who has always favored reconciliation. We can do some good if we work together. We have an opportunity to create positive change. And now is the time, he said, addressing the people sitting around the table. However, even his words could not douse the flames of hatred that had already flared among others. You want to start a support group for criminals, objected one of the participants, his voice full of disdain. How can you advocate for those who cause their own problems? It's their own fault for what happened to them. His words sparked outrage among the others, but it was this moment that made many realize how important it is to keep fighting for justice. Nevertheless, the resistance gradually gained strength. With each meeting, new faces joined them, and soon they began planning protests. Their goal was not only to draw attention to the problem of racism, but also to create a safe space for Lena's family. We have to create a petition to stop this madness and show that we are not silent, exclaimed Kira, a young mother, her eyes burning with determination. We could organize a rally to draw attention to this issue, Michael suggested. Everyone in the room nodded their heads, exchanging glances full of hope and determination. We will represent all the voices of our community, and we will do it together, he added, raising his fist in the air. Their preparations began by distributing leaflets and creating social networks to unite people willing to speak out against hate. They sought support from local anti-racist organizations and human rights groups. Each new contact strengthened their resolve and showed their resistance was becoming a reality. However, not all neighbors approved of their actions. From time to time, threats and insults were heard against them, especially from supporters of the policemen. You are betraying our community, they shouted, waving placards with provocative inscriptions, but the activists remained steadfast. They knew they had to continue despite the attacks. While they planned their action, Lena and John, unaware of what was happening outside their home, continued to live in fear. Every night they prayed for someone to come to their rescue, but their hopes looked increasingly elusive. When John looked at his children, he knew he could not allow them to live in constant fear. Nevertheless, there was still hope in their hearts. Lena decided to write a letter to the local newspaper, telling what had happened to them. She wanted her voice to be heard, to let people know that they were not alone in this nightmare. When it was time for the rally, the streets were filled with people who came to support Lena's family. Their placards rattled, "Justice for all," and "We're against hate." Lena, seeing this, felt tears come to her eyes. She realized that her family was not alone, and this became a source of strength for her. "We're here to support you," shouted one participant. "We will not let hate rule our community." Those words sounded like music to her ears. In that moment, Lena realized the fight is not over, but they are not alone. The resistance they had dreamed of had become a reality, and together they would fight for their truth, their family, and their dignity. The day after the rally, a tense atmosphere prevailed in the city. Many people were discussing the events that had taken place at the rally and the news about the support given to Lena's family. But it also attracted the attention of the police officers, who was not going to sit back and let his actions go unchecked. The policeman, whose name was Daniel, reminded himself again. Clenching his fists, he watched as people gathered around Lena's house, showing their support. Anger glittered in his eyes. He wasn't going to let anyone question his authority or actions. They don't know what they're dealing with, he muttered, his voice full of contempt. Deciding it was time to show his strength, he put on his uniform and headed towards his family's home. When Lena and her husband John saw him approaching, their hearts beat faster. Inside, everything trembled with fear, but they knew they had to confront this man. Lena clutched John's hand tightly, and they both knew that this would be a pivotal moment for their family. "What do you want?" Lena asked, her voice full of rage and fear. She stood in front of the door, gritting her teeth and trying to hide the trembling in her hands. Behind her back, a group of supportive neighbors were gathering. They too were determined, but fear gripped their hearts. "I'm here to remind you who's really in charge of order around here," Daniel said with a smirk, his tone full of contempt. "You all need to know your place, and I am here to make sure you understand that." His words were like a chilling wind passing through his veins, filling the atmosphere with fear. "You can't just come in here and threaten us," John exclaimed, his voice resembling a growl. He stepped forward, trying to protect his family and show his resilience. "We're not afraid of you," but Daniel only grinned, moving closer to John. "Oh, you don't realize who you're dealing with yet. You and your family are just targets in this town. And if you think you can tell me what to do, you're sorely mistaken." He spread his arms, as if pointing them out as an object of hatred. The supportive neighbors began to bunch up, their eyes full of hatred for the policeman. They shouted words of support for the family, but Daniel only laughed back, his eyes full of threat. "It's funny how you all try to protect this family. They're worthless, and you should realize that," he uttered, ratcheting up the tension. Those gathered began to discuss what to do. "We have to stand up for them," whispered one woman, her voice shaking with excitement. "We can't just stand by and watch this." But Daniel, feeling threatened, moved to aggressive action. He pulled out his baton and pointed it at the crowd. "If any of you try to interface, I won't hesitate to do it tough. Get your noses out of other people's business, and then you will have no trouble. But if you want a war, I'll give you one." His threat hung in the air like a poisonous gas. Lena felt fear overwhelming her, but at the same time there was a desire to fight. She realized that if she didn't confront him, they would never be able to live peacefully. "You have no right to threaten our family," she said with growing confidence. "We won't let you bully us, and we won't run away from this hatred." Lena's words, full of bravery, were like a spark igniting a fire of determination in the hearts of their neighbors. "We're here to protect you," shouted one of them, his voice overlapping Daniel's muffled threats. Others began to back him up, creating a barrier between the cop and the family. The hatred with which Daniel had come began to turn against him in return. "You're all just a bunch of cowards hiding behind each other's backs," he shouted, but his words were already losing their force. Lena and John felt their confidence growing. Together with their neighbors, they began to step forward without yielding, and each step reminded them that they were not alone. "Go away, Daniel. You're not needed here," John pronounced, his voice full of rage and determination. "We're standing up for our rights, and no one can threaten us." At that moment, not only Lena and John were fighting for their lives, but everyone gathered had decided to unite against hate. The confrontation reached its peak as Daniel began to retreat, realizing that his fear and aggression were no longer working. The neighbors were closing in on him step by step, and he suddenly felt himself losing control of the situation. "This isn't over," he shouted, backing away, but there was no longer confidence in his voice. He knew that if he didn't leave, he could face the consequences of his actions. As soon as he left, Lena and John looked at each other. Their eyes reflected joy and fear at the same time. "We did it," Lena whispered, hugging John. They realized there would be many more struggles ahead of them, but in that moment, they experienced the power of unity and togetherness. This was a milestone day for them, and they knew that together they could overcome any challenges. The situation in the neighborhood was heating up like heat in the summer sun. The confrontation with police officers, Daniel, only added fuel to the fire, and the residents, once disparate, began to realize the strength they could create together. News of the incident quickly spread throughout the city, attracting the attention of not only the locals, but also the media. The day after the open confrontation, many people gathered in the neighborhood, including activists, human rights groups, and journalists, ready to support Lena's family. They came to the house to express solidarity and ask the question, "What do we do next?" There was hope for change in the air, but also fear of police retaliation. Lena and John realized that the next step needed to be taken. "We can't just sit around and wait," Lena said as they gathered with neighbors in the house. "We need to get justice. We have to file a complaint about Daniel's actions and bring attention to this madness." The agreement and support of the people around her gave her courage. They knew they needed to speak up about what had happened and how it affected the entire community. Gathering, they began to formulate a plan. "We can contact human rights organizations," John suggested. "They can help us with the legal side of the issue." They soon arranged a meeting with a lawyer who agreed to help prepare and file a complaint against the police officers. Meanwhile, Daniel struggled to deal with the consequences of his actions. His reputation, once impenetrable, began to crumble. His every move at the police station was accompanied by whispers and disgruntled looks. His colleagues began to question his methods, and he couldn't shake the feeling that his time was coming to an end. "Are you out of your mind?" questioned one of his partners when they met in the hallway. "Do you know that this rally has caused a ruckus all over town? People are demanding your head." Daniel knew his actions had caused resentment, but he wasn't about to give up. He continued to talk about how he was doing everything for the sake of order, not noticing how his words had become hollow. While the residents were gathering and preparing to file a complaint, they also decided to hold a protest to draw attention to the situation. Their posters and slogans called for justice, "Hate has no place in the police," and "We demand justice for Lena and her family." People came not only to support the family, but also to send a message that they will not allow themselves and their neighbors to be oppressed further. As the day of the action approached, many people came to Lena's house, ready to support her and her family. They stood shoulder to shoulder, forming a living chain of solidarity as they began shouting slogans. Lena, standing on the balcony of her house, felt the excitement. She knew this was their moment, the moment when they could make a difference in the world. "We're here to support you," shouted one of the neighbors, holding up a poster of Lena and her family. "Your voices are important." The support gave Lena confidence, and she stepped forward to address the crowd. "Today we are united, and we demand to be heard. We want to be respected and protected." People cheered her on, and each shout grew louder. Their determination made even passers-by stop and join the movement. Everyone knew that they were now taking a step towards justice. Lena felt her heart fill with hope as she saw the support of her family and friends. Daniel was watching from a distance, however, and his anger was building. He realized that now the confrontation would escalate even more. "These people don't know who they're dealing with," he uttered, clenching his fists with rage. He knew that his time was coming to an end, and that he had to do something to regain control of the situation. When the crowd reached the local government, they filed a formal complaint against Daniel's actions. This step became a symbol of the struggle for rights and justice. Lena and her family realized that their actions could now affect not only them, but the entire community. Each of them realized that they were writing a new chapter in their city's history, a chapter of resistance, resilience, and unity. As the protest continued, there were shouts of support, but also whispers of hatred in the streets. Daniel began organizing his supporters among his colleagues, and his words of threats and order continued to fuel the hatred. He knew that this was not the end, and that his actions could still cause further repercussions. "We need to act," he whispered to his supporters. "We have to show that order is more important than any protests." This hatred, being pervasive, only intensified the conflict, but the residents were not about to back down. They knew they were standing up for justice, and they were willing to fight to the end. Each new step in this confrontation strengthened their resolve. Lena, John, and their neighbors knew they were on a dangerous path, but it was necessary to make things right and bring peace back into their lives. The flames of justice were fanning their tongues, and they realized it was time for those flames to become instruments of retribution. Darkness filled the room where Daniel sat alone, his face illuminated only by the dim light of the desk lamp. The noise outside had all but subsided, but a storm raged in his soul. He felt fear and anger intertwine, creating a darkness in which he could find no solace. Every memory of his conflict with Lena's family, of protesting and demanding justice, haunted him like a shadow. It had been a few days since he had defied the crowd, and with each hour he spent alone, his thoughts grew darker and darker. "Why is this happening to me?" he thought, clenching his fists. "I was only doing my job, protecting order." But deep down, Daniel realized that his actions were driven as much by fear as by hatred. His memories of his childhood surfaced in his mind. He grew up in a family where racism was considered the norm. Every conversation, every joke, every gesture, all shaped his perception of the world. "They will always be inferior to us," his father repeated when Daniel was just a boy. Those words imprinted themselves on his subconscious like a seal on his skin. He wanted to be like his father to earn his approval, and those beliefs became his inner demons. "I must protect my home," he said aloud, looking around the room as if seeking solace amidst the emptiness. But the fear and hatred he had so carefully avoided surfaced. He remembered the faces of the people who had protested, their anger and determination that had shattered his confidence in an instant. These new ideals of justice and equality seemed to him a threat that kept him on his toes. Sounds from the outside world reached his ears. The cries of support for Lena's family continued unabated. Every time he heard them, a wave of anger rose inside him. They don't understand what's going on, he thought, trying to convince himself that his actions were justified. They don't know what it's like to protect their own. His fears began to overlap, like layers of a veil that was already difficult to remove. He was afraid of losing control of his life, of his status. He knew that if this continued, he could lose his job, his friends, everything he held dear. He couldn't let that happen. Every time his thoughts took him to the abyss, he sought solace in violence, like an old friend who was always waiting for him in the shadows. In the midst of his internal struggle, he recalled the moments when he was able to intimidate people. It was a power he didn't want to lose. I have to remind them who's in charge, he whispered to himself as another feeling of unease set in. Every step he took toward intimidation was an attempt to regain his own dignity and control over his life. Daniel felt his world crumbling, and fear filled his heart. He worried that all his preconceptions would be exposed, that his personal demons would come to the surface and expose his true nature. It was an agonizing existence, waking up every morning with the feeling that the world was against him, that he was on the edge of a precipice. Changes began to take place in his mind. His fears and prejudices began to take shape, and he began to question, what if I was wrong? What if my hatred is only making things worse? These thoughts crept into his mind like poison, but he tried to ignore them. He couldn't afford to. Daniel was sure that if he gave in, it would mean the end for him and his ideals. Every night, he was immersed in arguments with himself. He tried to find excuses for his actions, but more and more often he was confronted with an incontrovertible truth. His hatred did not protect him, but only deepened the gulf between him and the rest of the world. He could no longer look at himself in the mirror, and this realization made him even more afraid. Sitting in his room, surrounded by darkness, he suddenly felt the urge to change everything. He remembered Lena and John, their courage and determination to fight for their rights. Maybe this is the path to freedom, he wondered, but his inner demons whispered back, don't believe it, they only want to destroy your world. Meanwhile, fear began to turn into rage. He felt he could no longer stand by. He must act before his own inner demons took over. Daniel began to plan his revenge, reinforcing his beliefs of hate, even though deep down he knew it was just a way to run away from his own fears and weaknesses. Each night became more and more agonizing for him. He didn't know if he would ever be able to rid himself of his inner demons, but this time they certainly wouldn't leave him alone, and he decided he had to take a step into the dark future to try to regain his power. Several weeks had passed since the protests and solidarity actions that had rocked the city. Lena's family could finally breathe a sigh of relief, knowing that people supported them. But outside their home, the conflict did not subside. Tensions remained, and the wounds caused by hatred and violence still needed healing. Lena and John decided to organize a meeting for all residents of their district. They realized that only together could they bridge the divide, and it was important to create a space where everyone could voice their feelings and concerns. The meeting brought together both supporters and opponents, and there was a mixture of hope and fear in the air. When Lena stepped on stage, she felt her heart pounding. She knew their meeting was a chance not only for her family, but for the entire community. Today we are here to talk about hate and how we can move toward change together, she began, her voice sounding confident despite her excitement. Hate is not just a word, it is an emotion that can destroy lives. It tears communities apart and erases humanity. She continued. Lena talked about how she and John face violence and bias, and how it changed their understanding of the world. But I believe we can change that. We can choose the path of understanding and love. The hall filled with whispers as she addressed her neighbors. We're all different, and that's okay. But instead of letting fear control us, let's learn from each other. Let's create a fellowship program where we can share our stories and understand our differences. We can have workshops where experts teach us how to recognize and confront racism. She noticed how some faces began to lighten while others remained closed, but she knew this was just the beginning. Let's say no to hate. Let's develop respect and understanding in our community. We must work together to build a future free of bias. Eventually, hands began to rise in the hall, and people began to discuss how they could help. Some suggested starting a self-help program for youth. Others suggested creating interest groups to bring people together who had not previously socialized. The protests led to active dialogue, and everyone realized that change was possible if they acted together. The day after the meeting, They were already in action. Lena and John organized their first session to discuss racism. They were joined by neighbors who had previously been kept at bay by fear. Openness, honesty, and a willingness to hear each other became the foundation for the first step toward change. Meanwhile, a transformation began in Daniel's mind as he continued to struggle with his own demons. He began to realize that his hatred and fear were not the answer. His former views, which had once seemed right to him, began to crack under the onslaught of the new reality. When he heard about the meeting in the neighborhood, he felt the need to go there. When he arrived at the meeting, he was confronted with his most frightening realities, faces that were affected by his actions, and a society that demanded change. Sitting in the audience, he could no longer deny that his hatred was only a reflection of his own fears and insecurities. He had seen people overcome their biases and learn to work together, and it had served as a turning point in his life. Lena noticed him in the background, and their gazes met. In that second, she realized that even those who show hatred could change at some point. We can start with ourselves, she thought as she noticed Daniel bow his head. This could be the beginning of his journey to redemption. The city slowly but surely began to change. Public meetings, exchanges, and awareness-raising activities became part of the new reality. A community previously gripped by fear and hatred was gaining unity and understanding. In this way, the path to change became possible not only for Lena's family, but for the entire community. Each of them, starting with themselves, became an example of how to fight hate. One spark of understanding can ignite the flame of change. And now they were all on their way to a brighter future, a future free of hate and prejudice. Dear viewers, we are very interested in your opinion about our story. Share in the comments what you think about the topics raised. Have you experienced racism or bias in your life? Your stories are important, and we value every word. Each and every one of you makes a huge difference to us, and we are grateful for your support. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and give us a like to help us continue to make content that brings up important topics. We wish you a great day. Thank you for being with us.